So the webinar is open for the online guests. Thank you for all attending in person. There's food in the back, like I said. We have a genealogist here in person, Ron Graham, over here. If you have any additional questions, you can see him. You can see him after, during. Just take him aside and get your questions answered. There will be a Q&A at the very end of the presentation that you can ask to our genealogist that's online. There is a genealogist that's answering online questions in the Q&A as well. So I will have a mic to go around at the very end to also let you guys answer questions as well. So, yeah. Okay. Can you go find DJ? And then he should be able to find it for you. He's at the front, right outside. He should be right outside the doors. Yeah. Okay. So we are about to get started in 1 minute. Oh, you can barely hear me? Give me 1 second. Tell him we're about to start the Zooms. Okay, so I'm going to have to project really loud. Is that okay for y'all? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Stories of Us Breaking Down the Census Records, presented by Justice for Greenwood. My name is Jasmine Henry. I serve as the We Are Greenwood Program Director, and thank you again for joining us tonight. So, whether you're here in person or you are live on Zoom, we really appreciate you being here. Tonight's presentation will be recorded and we'll share the link with you afterwards. If you have any questions anytime during the presentation, please add them to the Q&A feature if you're online, or you can raise your hand at the very end and we'll call on you. A genealogist will be answering the questions on the Q&A throughout the presentation. Some questions might be asked out loud for the people that are in the Q&A. And so if you do not want your question announced as your name, you can put yourself as anonymous. So I would like to know where a lot of people are from online. We have a lot of people in the room right now from the Tulsa area. So I'm going to put up a poll and see where we are. With our Zoom attendees. Give me 1 second. See if I can stop. Okay. So that poll launched, and just answer those questions as they come through, and then we'll talk through them at the very end. So those of you who are not familiar with the Justice for Greenwood project, so we are a community-based organization dedicated to supporting the survivors and descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Through our genealogy project, we help families with their ancestry. We document their family history. We reconnect them with their roots and tell their full story of who they are. Our workshop series, The Stories of Us, continues this important work, and we're offering hands-on tools to learn about what you can do to find your family in their roots. Because I want to make sure that Angela gets enough time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. It is my great pleasure to introduce our main presenter. Her name is Angela Walton Raji. She is a nationally known genealogist author, podcaster, who has been conducting family history research since the 1990s. She has written numerous books, including the Oklahoma Freedmen of the Five Tribes, published this year. Angela's groundbreaking work has shed light on untold stories of Black women who served as civilian employees during the Civil War. In recognition of her contributions, she received the Malcolm H. Stern Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Genealogical Society in 2023. Angela, we are honored to have you with us tonight. The floor is yours. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate that wonderful introduction, and hello to everyone in the Greenwood family. I am thrilled to be here, and I'm excited, of course. Well, I love talking about genealogy, any opportunity that I get. And so I'm really excited to be able to speak to people who are interested in not just exploring their own family history, but documenting their ties perhaps to the Greenwood community in Tulsa. And if you were here last month for our, you will recall that I gave an overview of genealogy in general. And I talked about the different types of records to use, those vital records, birth, marriage, death records. But I also talked about the census, but I didn't dive as deeply into it as I hope that we'll be able to do this evening. So this session, what we're going to do is it's called Breaking Down the Census. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, we're going to look at the many aspects of the federal census from 1950 to 1870. And as you may know or recall from the last month's presentation, the census has been conducted every 10 years since 1790. But you might say, well, hey, this is 2025. Why are you stopping at 1950? My mother wasn't born until 1964. Well, the fact is that the census is sealed for 72 years from the public for public examination or public inspection. And that's to protect the privacy of living people. But after we go through different aspects of the census, and feel free if you have questions to type them. We have people who are on hand to answer some of your questions on the screen in the chat. Just put your questions or in the Q&A. And we'll try and address some of them. And I hope that if some of you were here last month, that maybe you've decided to take a look and see if you can find grandma or grandpa in the federal census. But we're going to talk about that. So we're going to talk about everything from 1950 back to 1870, and I'll explain why 1870 in a moment or so. And also, you know, afterwards, I know many people don't have a history that goes back 4 generations in Tulsa. Maybe it goes back just 3, or in some cases 2. And maybe your ancestors, they arrived in what became Oklahoma, maybe in 1915 and moved to Tulsa. Well, they may have come from another state, and there are ways for you to go and research those ancestors, whether they're from Kansas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, wherever they may have been and ended up in Oklahoma. And of course, we're going to try and help you if there are any brick walls that you have to answer questions that, okay, I know who my folks are and I found them in 1920. What do I do next? Or where do I go next? I know that they were in Tulsa. What happens at this point? So we're going to talk about that in general. So let's take a look and just sort of see where we are with those records. And see, I hope my screen is going to move here a little bit just to get it to advance. So this is a typical census form that you're going to see. Typically 50 people on a page. Now, this is typical, not every census year, because there are going to be exceptions. And as the years progress through the 1900s, you're going to find they're going to change in multiple ways. But typically, you have 50 names. Each, you see there are 50 lines on that page. And you see that you get information. You get their ages. You get the relationship of individuals to the head of the house. Now, that didn't happen every census year, and we'll talk about that. But you also learn about the birthplace of every single person. And then you also learn of the birthplace, and even though I know it's not sharp, in the middle, you see those 3 columns. One is the birthplace of the person on that line, followed by the birthplace of that person's father, and the birthplace of that person's mother. And that can be very useful. And then, of course, information about their occupation if they had an occupation during that year. So we're going to first of all begin by outlining the steps that you're going to follow to be able to connect to an ancestor who may have come to Tulsa, to the Greenwood community in particular. And of course, I know that many of you want to know, well, how do I go back further than 1921? Are there records? Yes, there are. And if your ancestors lived, then they have left a paper trail. So it's always important to realize that. And many things that happen in their lifetime, they left some footprints. If they got married, there's a marriage record, there's an index you may want to look at, there's a certificate you might be able to find. Now, of course, as I always say, and I emphasized this in last month's session, you're always going to start with yourself and write down what you know. You know who your parents are. Well, write both of their names. Write your mother's maiden name. You know who your grandparents are, or do you? Do you know that you have 4 grandparents because each of your 2 parents had a father and a mother? So that's 4. But each of those grandparents had a father and a mother. So that's 8. So you'll begin to notice, oh, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. You see what's happening. Those ancestors are doubling. So you may know 2 of your grandparents, but do you know the other 2? And do you know then the next set of 4, which would be 4 sets of parents, do you know the 8 great-grandparents, and so on? And as you go further back in time, the number of direct line ancestors that you have is going to double. But of course, this is part of what we do. And those of us who are totally immersed in this process, we love it. We love the hunt. And you're always going to hit a brick wall. Understand that. Expect that. It's going to happen. We can sometimes assist you in breaking through brick walls. Still have brick walls. And so, and sometimes those walls cannot be broken through us. The information has been lost. I have an ancestor who was born in 1889, but they didn't get captured in the 1890 census. And we'll talk about that and why that may have happened. So anyway, let's go and take a look and see what those steps are. And I already mentioned since 1790. Now, don't forget the the United States began in 1776, but the census, the first documented body count, we say, occurred in 1790. And understand something. The census was not created for us, meaning for you or for me to go find our people. The census was created to determine how many people lived in every state and then to determine how many representatives Congress that particular state will have. That's really the purpose of the census. It's we have a situation where we can take a look at those records. And the fact that you do want to keep in mind, you can't look at what was filled out in 2020 or in 1990. That is because there is a 72-year waiting period in terms, oh dear, did my screen just change? There is a 72-year waiting period in terms of those records being released to the public. And that's to protect the privacy of living people. You can't go and see what your neighbor across the street may have filled out on the census. And they can't go and take a look at information that you may have filled out on your census form. Notice I said filled out, because up until, I guess it was either 1980 or 1990, the census was conducted by a census taker. A person came to the house, spoke to whoever was there, and collected data on the individuals in that household. But After that time, in recent years, in the last 3 or 4 census counts, individuals have been able to self-provide information. If you may recall, 5 years ago, filling out the census form, you could put down what your ethnicity was, whereas in 1920, let's say 100 years ago, that wasn't the case. You had a census taker who would come and look at you and, oh, okay. Oh, looks hair's kind of curly, skin's kind of tan. Oh, he's probably Negro, and they would write it down. So it was the census taker. But it's a little bit different now because we do self-report, and we do tell people, make sure you fill it out. Your great-grandchildren will thank you for filling it out, especially since it is self-reported these days. Now, at the present time, for genealogical purposes, the census that you can look at will begin in 1950. 1960 census will not be released for another 7 or so years, and 2032 is the year that the 1960 census will be available. So that means, however, for your purposes, if you're trying to connect to a Greenwood ancestor, well, you still have 1950, 1940, 1930, and 1920 to look at, and they are available. And thankfully, through technology, these records are digitized now. You don't have to go to a library and pull up microfilm, which I had to do when I first started doing genealogical research. And there's still value in microfilm, but I won't go down that right now. These records you can look at your local library if you do not have an account with Ancestry.com. Most libraries do, but you can also look at the census on a site that is free, so you don't have to pay the subscription fee, on a search called familysearch.org, and that's another option for you. Now, in general, for African American family research, there are some real challenges. You can find, in general, and I'm speaking very much in general, not 100%, especially if you have people who've been in Oklahoma longer than Oklahoma has been Oklahoma, meaning Indian Territory, you're going to have a few challenges there. But if your ancestors are from Tennessee, Arkansas, other states, Texas, wherever, you should be able to, with some research, I'm not going to say it's 100% easy, but with some real just elbow grease, you should be able to get into those records back to 1870. And prior to 1870, and keep in mind what happened before 1870, what happened between 1860 and 1870, the Civil War occurred. The war ended in 1865, and all people who had been enslaved were now freed people. But that means, however, 1870 is particularly important for African American family research because that's the very first year that people who were once enslaved were recorded in the federal census by name. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. 1 or 2 counties in 1860 may have written down the names of slaves, but very, very few. For the most part, 1870 is sort of the wall of demarcation between documenting people who had been enslaved and people who were free people. And in 1870, everybody was listed for the first time, with exception of those who had been enslaved in Indian Territory. It would be a year after the Civil War before slavery was abolished. But in addition, now you can still get an idea if you're able to determine who the slaveholder was in your family, and that is a certain step of genealogical research. Then you can also look at the 1860 slave. It's a slave census, which is called schedule. By the way, these are called schedule. The census record that you're looking at on the right is a census schedule. Well, there is something called a slave schedule, how in 1860 and in 1850. However, it's kind of misleading, or it's kind of a misnomer, because the slaves are not listed by name. They appear as little tick marks going down that long page of individuals. However, it is a list the names that you do see are the names of the slaveholders. So if you are at a stage, and it's not a stage for beginners, but if you're at that stage of identifying slaveholder, you can still learn something about your ancestors, even though there may be a tick mark on that page. You'll learn something about them because you'll be able to determine, oh, my ancestors were owned by Robert Jones. Oh, wow. Oh, he had a bunch of farms. So that tells you that if your ancestor was enslaved in that particular slave community, wow, they were on a large plantation. But you may find in another town, in another state or county, you find, oh, this was the slaveholder, and you find that slaveholder's name on that 1860 slave schedule. Oh, he only had four slaves. That's telling you something else. Oh, my ancestors were slave, but they were just in a family group, or they were enslaved with other people. But just a handful of them. That tells you about the social experience they may have had at that time of enslavement for them. Were they in a large community of slaves with, blocks, or just a long line of slave cabins? Or were they in one slave cabin enslaved by one small family? So you can still learn some details about the family that way. So, one thing that you're going to find as you go back, and let's say you get to 1930, 1920, and you say, oh, well, this looks like my family, but they're spelling their name wrong. Well, they're not spelling their name at all. Keep in mind, it's the census enumerator. Look at that image on the right. If you notice, the penmanship is all the same because it was all written by the same one person, the census enumerator, the census taker. And that individual wrote the names as they were told to him or to her. And let's say the family is a family and there's somebody called Green. I'm just making up a name right now for you. Well, someone might look and say, well, the names kind of look right, but oh, they're spelling their name wrong. No, we always spell our name Greene. Well, what's the difference in pronunciation between green with an E on the end and Green? No E on the end. They're both pronounced green. In addition, the family itself was not the person doing the writing or the spelling in this case. It's the enumerator who wrote it the way he or she thought it should be written. So a lot of people will just assume, oh, these are not our people because we spelled it differently. You and your family may have spelled it differently, and keep in mind, especially in those early census years after slavery ended, 1870, 1880, even up to 1900, 1910, many of them were illiterate. They could not read, write, or spell. So as a result, understand that that spelling sort of stuck with the family after literacy became immersed in the family group. So understand that. Also, you'll find that names can vary. You'll see that I, for example, can give an example. My great-grandparents, Lewis Mitchell Bass, every census year he's different. One year he's Lewis Bass, another year he's L.M. Bass, just initials. The census taker didn't even bother to write out his name. Another census, he's Mitchell Bass. And so how was I able to determine I had the right family? Well, the wife and the children were consistent, thankfully. But you may find that, again, sometimes depending upon who's talking, and also what's the family culture. In my family, in that particular family branch, they tend to give the children a first, a middle, and a surname, of course, but they oftentimes refer to that child by the middle name. My grandmother's name from that very household I'm talking about, her name was Sarah Ellen Bass. Everybody called her in the family Ellen. All my cousins who knew her as Aunt Ellen. We're going to go see Aunt Ellen. And her name was Sarah Ellen. Um, It's also interesting with my great grandfather, Louis Mitchell Bass, when people refer to him, it's great grandpa Mitchell or grandpa Mitchell. So the middle name, and even within my own family, I have a middle initial Y for Yvette. Those in my close family circle know me as Yvette or Aunt Yvette or whatever, although the world knows me as Angela. And I used to freak out my roommate in college. She was like, "You have a double personality?" No, I don't, but it's just the family dynamic. And of course, you'll also find ethnically something can change in the census record. And one year they appear as Black, another year they're going to be Negro, another year going to be colored, another year they may have been mulatto in the very beginning. So you will find that. So you have to learn as you're finding it. Just don't look at it and fail to analyze what you're looking at, because that is something that is going to be very, very important. Your ability to analyze the facts as you see them. Now, I mentioned 1790 to 1950. So when you start with census records, you're also always going to start with the most recent to work back. Just like when you're writing down your little names on your notepad, you start with yourself. Go to your parents, go to your grandparents, go to your great grandparents, and so on. Well, you're going to start with census records in 1950. And you might say, well, I know they were in Tulsa. They were definitely there in 1920. They probably were. But your goal should be to learn as much as you can about the family and find as many stories about them. Hopefully, you're going after more than just a list of names. You want to be able to capture the essence of what made your family your family. So you're going to start with 1950, and you're going to go on the two sites that I recommended and work your way back. The two sites, of course, familysearch.org. This site is free. It is run by the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, and that is because part of the tenets of their religious faith consists of really researching your ancestors. And because of that, and because many people who are Mormons come from all over the country, they've gone all over the country and they have copied records from everywhere. For many years, those records were locked up in a vault in the mountains. Well, guess what? They're pulling them out of the mountains all the time. They're uploading, actually, I want to say 100,000 records a day, and that's a modest number. I think it's much, much higher than that. But they're being digitized, and that's the best news, because now you can look at not just census records from 1950 to 1790, but you can look at marriage records, you can look at wills, probate records of slaveholders. You can learn so much more. Plus, they also have a lot of records. They have books that they have fully microfilmed and now digitized. And there's so much that you can do. So this is a free site. I'm mentioning this only if you do not have an account on Ancestry.com, my favorite site. I'm on there every single day. I'm on it right now, actually, because I never sign out of it. That's what I mean. But this is a subscription site. I do recommend, if you don't have an account, to use your library. Of course, they have certainly an institutional account, but also if you're thinking about an ancestry, a tip: every holiday that's a family holiday, such as Thanksgiving, such as Christmas, New Year's holiday season, they usually go on sale. So consider, perhaps purchasing or subscribing to Ancestry when it's on sale. Their regular price, $99 or $100. In recent months, they've been dropping it down to $39. So a little bit more affordable for some people. So consider that. I'm on it all the time, so I do recommend it. But again, you still have access at your public library as well. Now, in terms of what you're going to find on both of those sites, you're going to find the federal census records, all those census years. You're also going to find those slave schedules, the slave census, the one that lists the slave owner's name and then, tick marks for how many slaves, how many male, how many female, how many slave cabins there were on that estate. And how many were fugitives from the state. I have found, though, sometimes you can tell when the census taker did not follow the instructions. I know, I believe it's Cass County, Texas, in 1850, I believe it was. The census taker, I guess, didn't read all the instructions and copy the names of all the enslaved people. So if you have people from that part of Texas, you might be in luck. But by 1860, he knew what the rules were and did not record the names of the enslaved people. But that's still a tip. There may have been another county where that occurred. I think it may have been in the Carolinas, but across the board in general, on the slave schedule, you're not going to find the names of the enslaved. There is a non-population census. However, what you as a beginner may want to know simply that those first two bullets there, federal census and slave schedules, that is what you will find on both Family Search and on Ancestry. There is something called the industrial census where businesses were surveyed. The type of business, was it a sawmill? Was it an industry that was producing or processing, such as a cotton gin that was processing the raw cotton, preparing it to be shipped to New York and then shipped to England or wherever. There's the agricultural census, which later on, when you're beyond that beginning stage, you might find the agricultural census useful. You might want to know, well, how many hogs or cows did great grandpa have? Or what did they grow? Were they growing corn? Were they growing tobacco? Were they growing cotton? What were they actually growing? So you can learn a little bit about them. However, those first two items that you're looking at, the federal census every 10 years and the slave schedules, those are the ones as at the beginning stage that you'll need to know the most. And you can be a beginner for quite some time. Now, I did mention some challenges that you're going to have. I already mentioned that where you may see the family surname. Sometimes you may find a totally different surname connected to your family. And there are ways to get around that particular challenge. There's a rule, I think, if you're familiar with Tony Burrow's research, and he did a book called Black Roots, which was a guide to African American genealogy. And he mentioned something called the Nettie rule. And the Nettie rule is one in which you've been meticulous. You've been documenting the family every 10 years, 1950, 40, 30, 20, 1900, 1910, 1900. But then you get into the 1800s and you're like, well, all these first names are all matching, but who are these people? And I can give you an example from my own experience. I have a family in Mississippi, and the family name was Young, Young. And I knew I was looking for someone called Amanda. I knew who was my mother's great grandmother. I knew she had a daughter, Harriet, a daughter, Violet, and there were some other children. I wasn't sure what their names were. So I'm looking in this county in Tippah County, Mississippi, and I have them. I have them in the 1900s, and I have them in 1880 census. But I'm looking at 1870, and I see Amanda, and I see Harriet, and I see Violet. But why does it say their name is Barr? What? Not a name that I recognized. And so I remember calling up my mother and asking her, have you heard the name Barr? No, never have. No, no, no. We're the Young family. That was the family surname. Okay. And then I spoke with an elderly cousin. And here's the lesson. When you find something, share it and consult the elders. And it doesn't have to be a great grandparent or a grandparent. It might be an older cousin. So I spoke to an older cousin who lived in Chicago. And hello, cousin Frances, how are you? And I told her, I was looking for her grandmother, who was my mother's great grandmother, Amanda Young. And I said, well, I think I found them, but I found Harriet and Violet and Amanda, but their last name was Barr. And she had a real sweet, high voice. And she said, well, that's kind of odd. Why would they do that? Elijah was the only one who was a Barr. What? Say that again? Well, Elijah, that was grandma's last child. She had him after the war. His last name was Barr. Now, this woman was probably the last living person in that family, in the family branch, who ever knew anything about the surname Barr. My mother never knew it. She never heard it from her grandmother, who ended up, being her elder, the matriarch of her family. I went right back to the 1880 census. Remember, I said I saw Harriet and Violet and Amanda, and there were a couple of other children. I didn't recognize the names. And there was a child in the household, the youngest child, called Elijah. But Cousin Francis was certain all the rest were youngs. Elijah was the only one. And then I realized, well, wait a minute. The head of that household was a gentleman called Pleasant Barr. And I had to go, and just on a hunch, he's a Barr. Amanda and the other children are listed as Barr. And sure enough, I was able to find a marriage record between Amanda Young and Pleasant Barr. So, oh my goodness. So, in this case, this was a surname, not forget even the situation where it was a different spelling. All the given names, the three names that I knew were there. But here's a surname that was different from what I had expected. So again, the lesson is talk to the elders. Every time you find a factoid, as they say on CNN or whatever, talk to an elder, talk to someone, even if it's just an older sibling who has earlier access to some of the family members than you may have. Another challenge, sometimes you'll see the ages don't match. Well, I heard she was 100 years old when she died, but you find her in the 1910 census and she died in 1902. But then, wait a minute, she was 100 years old, then she should have been 98 in the census year that I found her. But you find she's only 81. Well, sometimes you've got to understand something. Number one, at the time that person was born, back in the 1800s, there were no birth certificates. So ages were pretty much estimated. In addition, or we'll say ages are approximate. But in addition, if you're talking about a family that may have been enslaved and who may likely have been a family, especially among the elders in the family, who could not read or write or count, maybe did not know their own ages. And so you'll have from one census year to another, they don't even age 10 years. I have an ancestor who between 1910 and 1920, she only aged 3 years according to that census. But obviously it's an estimate that that person was really reporting about themselves. So sometimes again, those ages don't always match what you're expecting to see. Sometimes you may find a stranger in the household. And, I know that there's a gentleman, he's since passed away, a local man here in Maryland where I live. And he was a historian and genealogist himself. He was pretty much still a beginner because he documented a lot of the community's history as opposed to taking a deep dive into his own family lineage. And then one day, we decided, you know what, Mr. Diggs, we're going to go as far in your own family line. He said, oh, I'd love that. And when we showed him a family census, I believe it was 1930, he was like, who's that? Who's that child? That's a 5-year-old. I don't know that name. And I said, well, this person was in the household the day the census taker came. We'll put it that way. He said, yeah, but I'm in the house too, and I don't know who that is. And of course, it was an interesting conversation. But this may have been someone who was there temporarily. It may have been someone that he just recalled perhaps as maybe a near neighbor, but this person, when the enumerator came, was reported as a resident of that house. And again, he was a mere child himself. He was only like 3 or 4 years old, but he's trying to figure out who this 5-year-old child is. Many people don't remember all of the details of their early childhood life. And it can be a situation where this person's a stranger. I don't know who that is. So sometimes you find these, but this is part of where, again, speak to the elders. Who knew this person? Who knew your family? Who knew your parents? These are things that you want to be able to share, and you're only going to find some of these answers by sharing what you're finding. And then you may find, well, they always lived. You may decide that, wow, they always lived in Tulsa, but maybe you find them in 1910 and they were in Okmulgee or Oktaha or Summit or some other place, or maybe they were across the state line in Arkansas. So it's something that you may find challenging because it's not what you yourself expect to find. And trust me, you are going to find things you didn't expect when you're going through those census records. But that's part of the fun, I guess, of the hunt. Now, one of the things, there are so many benefits to using census records. Number one, especially if you're lucky and you have a big family, you can find more than one generation in the household, or more than two, parents and children. Sometimes you find grandparents in the household. That's a 3-generation situation. Or in some cases, you find that the head of the house, there's a grandchild in the house in relation to the person who's the head. That means that person's parent, they're obviously, he and the wife are the same generation, their children, and even a grandchild. So you can find multiple generations in a census record, which is always fun, which is why you've got to analyze who's everyone and read every word on those census records and start to analyze what you're seeing. And also look at the time period in which you are reviewing that record. You'll see, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the way the family is described, Negro 1 year, Black another year. And I know that one thing is very interesting. I remember I was helping a person who was very much a beginner in their research. And I was showing them a census record, and it may have been 1900. And in that census year, the family's listed as Black. And the person said, oh, they call themselves Black in those days. I thought it was always Negro or colored. I said, we weren't calling ourselves Black. I grew up in the 50s, and I know if you call somebody Black, oh my gosh, those were fighting words or spanking words. Or if a parent or grandparent was annoyed at a naughty child, they would refer to you as a mischievous, little Black boy, except they may have used more colorful language. But the point is that until the Black consciousness movement of the 1970s, we were not calling ourselves that. At least not our parents' generation or grandparents' generation. But we were being recorded as that. So that's something that's very enlightening to see. You realize as early as even 1870 census, they were listed as Black or mulatto, which by definition can mean biracial, or two ethnicities in terms of parentage. But it wasn't always so, because every census year, just like you can find the census online, you can also find the instructions to the census enumerators. And you will see that the enumerators were told, if the person has more Negroid features, then record them, but lighter skin, record them as mulatto. So it didn't always mean that one person was Black, one was white, because two light-skinned people will produce light-skinned children. So everyone in the household is not necessarily biracial. But understand still, you can learn a little bit about the family with those multiple generations. You also start to learn, what did they do? Were they all farmers? You'll learn in some census years, they owned their land. Oh, they were not sharecroppers. And that's one of those myths of the single story. Many Black people were sharecroppers, meaning they didn't own the land and they got to keep a tiny portion of what they grew. But there were Black homesteaders throughout the South, and many people do not know that. But look for home ownership, especially if it's in the rural South. They may have purchased their own land or become homesteaders under the Homestead Act of 1862, and many Black families did. So that occupation line is very, very important to pay attention to. And the ancestral birthplace. One thing is really interesting. I have often been just thrilled when I've looked at a particular record. I look at the birthplace. Oh, okay, they were born in Oklahoma. But then I look at the birthplace of their parents. And I have still found, in fact, I did a podcast on, I believe it's the Dunford family, and the mother of one of the people in the household was born in Africa. And to just be able to see that written, wow, it's still very, very enlightening to see that. But you learn where they were. Let's say you're researching a family from Oklahoma, but you don't know where they came from prior to Oklahoma. Oh my gosh, they came from Tennessee. Maybe you didn't know that. Maybe the mother came from one of the Carolinas, and maybe you did not know that. So you find a little bit of information about the birthplace of the parents. You have a person who was a child in 1920 census, and you just know that they were in Oklahoma, but you look over to the birthplace of the father and the mother, and you realize, oh my gosh, they were born in another state and then migrated here. So you want to be able to pay attention to that. And what an eye-opening thing that is. That's opening another door for you to follow as a genealogist. So you want to be able to do that. Sometimes also you'll see the name of a child that you've never heard of, and no one that you know has ever mentioned that child, because maybe that child was already an adult when your parent became an adult and had married and moved away. Or in some cases, maybe it was a child who was in the household who passed away because child mortality rate was high in certain years, and particularly because there were certain epidemics that also occurred. If you had parents in the 1920s who lived along the Mississippi Delta, there was a major flood in 1927 in the Delta of Mississippi. You can even see film footage. You can do a Google search and look at film footage reflecting the flood of 1927 in the Delta. There could be other tragedies that occurred, other storms, hurricanes, other types of natural disasters that may have taken the lives of loved ones. One thing that I particularly like in the 20th century records, even 1900, but 1910, 1920, and so on, is that sometimes you can learn where they lived, the exact street address. A lot of times you'll see in the left-hand margin along the side, you might see the name of the street. Now, those columns on that census page often will tell you this is family number 25 and this is house number 1904. Oh, they lived in 1904 and the side margin says 13th Street. So you learn a little bit about maybe their address. And of course, you know you can do a Google search using that address, reflecting that city and town to see what's there now. Is the house still there? Or is it an empty lot? Or is it a Pizza Hut? You know, what's there now? And you can still learn a lot about the family. Now, you're trying to trace, many of you, ancestors to Tulsa, to the Greenwood community. Understand the date. The date that the massacre occurred was May 31st in 1921. That means you have at least 4 census records to at least connect you there. Now, if you yourself were born in the 1940s, and of course you know your parents and perhaps grandparents who were in Tulsa, then you only have to connect your family to 1940, 1930, 1920. If you are younger and then have to really start a little bit closer, you have to start with 1950 and work your way back. Now, you may have data already, perhaps in your family archives, meaning the photo albums or other documents that are reflecting letters or old insurance papers, things that are connecting your family there. But if you are asked to prove that you have a tie, that means you're going to have to, provide what we call connective tissue, the tissue that's going to connect you to Tulsa through a paper trail. Now, for example, if I ask you, well, what are the names of your parents? And you tell me the names of your parents. Well, I don't have to really believe you until you provide me proof. Well, what's your proof? Your birth certificate is the proof. Once I see your birth certificate and the names of your parents there, then I just need to shut my mouth and go sit down because you've provided that evidence. Now, obviously, for yourself, you're going to provide information connecting you to your parents. But if this is, let's say, on your mother's line, that is the Greenwood connection that you have, then your mother, you're going to have to connect her to her mother and father who were Tulsa based or Tulsa descended people. Now, let's say that the targeted ancestor is a great grandparent. Connect yourself to your parents. And if it's your mom's side, connect yourself to your mother. Obviously, your birth certificate will do that. Let's say your mother was born out in the country and she didn't have a birth certificate. But is there a census record that's going to connect her? Also, if she has died in recent years, there is a death certificate, and hopefully the person who was the informant for that death certificate knew the names of her parents. You need something on paper to connect your mother to her parents, or obviously if it's your father's line, connecting your father to his parents, to the correct line that's going to connect you to Greenwood. And then, of course, you're going to follow with that family. Now, keep in mind, if it's a female ancestor and it's straight up the female line, remember to go after the maiden name of that female ancestor. But of course, you're going to go, as it says, 1950, 40, 30, and to 1920. 1920 is the year before the massacre occurred. So if they were in Tulsa in 1920, they were definitely in Tulsa in 1921. Now, we also utilize city directories, and it is very much important to take a look at that. But we do that here in terms of our research and what we're doing. Now, let's say that you have connected and you've been chronicled and verified as a descendant of a survivor of the Tulsa massacre of 1921. But you want to know more about your family. So in this particular case, then there are records prior to 1920s that you'll be able to go to. 1910, 1900, you see 1890, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. You see 1880 and 1870. 1890, usually I don't list it only because the 1890 census is missing. No, it's not lost. It burned up in a fire back in 1923 in Kansas City, a warehouse fire that happened to have been housing the census records of 1890. Most of those census records from 1890 were destroyed.
Angela,
And
can you hear me?
yes, I can.
Just wanted to let you know we have about 10 minutes left of the presentation.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for that reminder. So in 1923, that warehouse caught a fire. Most of the 1890 census was lost, with a few counties, I believe in West Virginia, maybe one or two other states, and that's it. Now, a few records did survive, such as there was a veterans census as well, and you may find some of veterans from the Civil War. But again, that general population census, for the most part, is just not available. Although there are records to still document the family, because keep in mind between that gap between 1880 and 1900, babies were still being born, people were still getting married, people were passing away, people were leaving a paper trail. So there are other records to fill that gap. It's just that 1890 census that we all want to see is just not available the way we'd want it to be, with a couple of exceptions. Another exception would be in Indian Territory. There's an 1890 census for the 5 tribes: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nations. So bullets to sort of remember. in 1870, that's the first census in which almost all people who had been slaves in the United States, they're going to be listed by name as people, not as tick marks. In 1880 is unique because you begin to learn not just who's in the house, but the relationship of everybody. Was this person a stepson or a real son or a grandson? Was the woman a sibling, a parent, or a spouse? So you learn the relationship of everyone in that household. Although 1890 is largely missing because of the fire in 1823, there are, of course, other methods of finding what was going on with that family. And my favorite census year is the 1900 census year, because that was the one census that provided the month and the year of birth of each person in the household. So that's always kind of exciting to see that. Here's an example of the 1900 census, which was the 12th census of the United States. And you see in that first household, you see the McGee family, and you see who's the head, who's the wife. You see they're listed as a Black family, and you see the gender, male or female. And if you see where it says date of birth, you'll see that the head of the house, Bill McGee, was born in December of 1855. And it's so exciting to be able to see something like that. Now, again, they may have been estimating, oh, it was Christmas and it was 5 or 6 years before the war started, because maybe they didn't know their exact date of birth, but sometimes they did. So it is important to understand that. And that's why I just always enjoy this. It also asks some other questions. For example, you see the column with number 17 written, and then you see a number 9, and then you see a number 6. Well, they'll ask how many years the couple's been married. So do the math. 1900, take away 17. Oh my goodness, they got married in what? In 1883. So you'll get to know. Keep in mind, every record's going to point you to another record. That's telling you to go after a marriage record from where they may have been from. And you see that number 9, and then you see number 6. They'll ask how many live births did the woman have, and how many children are still living, and you see 6. So you learn a little bit about the family. There's a loss there of children. You also learn where the person was born. That first column under that nativity set of those 3 columns, the person was born in Georgia, and so were their parents. Now, in the case of the wife, you see that she and her parents were all born in Texas. But if you get to the children, you can tell then how many of them were born in Texas. But you see that last child in the household was born in Indian Territory. You can almost guess when they moved to Indian Territory because of just the place of birth. So you learn a lot from the census records. And of course, you can zoom in a little bit here and see. This is a close-up of that family, that McGee family, for example. And you can see a little bit more closely the name, the relationship, the color or race, the gender, the month, and the year of birth. And you see their age at the time, how many years they've been married, and how many births? I said 9, that's actually a 7. She'd given birth to 7 children, and 6 were still living at that time. So you find just a tremendous amount of information. Now, in the 1910 census, you do get similar information on the household. And again, it did vary. And also in 1910, in not just Oklahoma, because now Oklahoma is a state after 1907. There's a special Indian census where information, instead of 50 people on a page, it's 25. The top of the half has the general information, and the bottom half has some more information about the people on the top half. In the case of my own family, which is the family highlighted at the top, at the bottom, it tells you a little bit more. If they were on an Indian census, what is their tribe? What's the tribe of their father? What's the tribe of their mother? And then you see some supposedly blood breakdowns. Don't take it seriously. You'll see, for example, my great-grandfather Sam, it says he's half Indian, half Negro, because his father was Cherokee, his mother was Black. my great grandmother, suddenly she's one fourth Indian and three-fourth Negro. What does three-fourths of a Negro mean, and how is that determined? And poor Grandpa Sam, he's three-eighths and five-eighths. It's nothing scientific. It's still interesting to look at, but you don't stress over it. It's just still something to pay attention to and to record. 1920 census, there was no special Indian census at this point, but all people from Native American communities were documented. 1930, they asked a particular question. Does the house have a radio? They don't ask that question in any other census year that I've seen so far. But yet they did at that point. The family's also just coming out of the Depression. Well, no, they're going into the Depression deeply because it's 1930. The market crashed in 29. But you'll see where I've highlighted in red, they want to know if the family has a radio set. So you find that the questions do change. In 1940, the only year you know who spoke to the census taker. See the names in red? You'll see an X with a circle drawn around it. That was the informant. That's who spoke to the census taker. It's the only census year in which they're identified. And you'll find some other features. They'll ask, well, where was the family living in 1935? This is now when the country rather was coming out of the Depression. And they wanted to know, was the family migrating or was the family still living there? 1950, again, it goes back to a similar structure. But again, keep in mind, 1960 will not be available until 2032. Before Tulsa and statehood, just remember those years that you're going to be able to look at. I've already gone over those. And 1870 at least is a landmark year in which you should be able, with a little bit of work, to be able to get to that family in 1870. So I'll stop here. I know we're out of time in terms of my session, but we can explore the census, or what have you found if you've already done research, or do you have any questions? I'll turn it back over. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll turn things back over to you, Jasmine.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we all hear you. Well, I hear you.
Okay, perfect. It looks like we had a ton of questions answered in the Q&A already, so I'm going to let the in-person crowd ask some questions.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions?
And see, Nika was probably, I'm sure, handling a lot of those questions. Anything stand out, Nika, in particular?
No, just a lot of general questions. So
Okay.
yeah, so we're good. There's some that are live now. Let's see, people, lots of kudos,
Oh,
telling you thank you for this session. And so yeah, I think this one is a little bit longer. You may want to address this one. The person mentions that they have an ancestor on the Dawes roll. They list the ID number. Their great grandmother Lizzie Haggerty is their daughter. They're looking to obtain tribal membership into the nation. But whoever the person is, can you list what nation this is supposed to be? Because we don't know offhand based on the number. I wish there was a system like that.
yeah, really.
Where you would know, like 52722 is, everybody that starts off like that is Cherokee. We don't
That's
have
right. I know. I'm telling you, you have to talk to people in Ancestry to give you the hookup.
that.
I'm telling you. Oh my goodness.
He says it's Creek Nation.
Okay, they're in Creek
Right.
Nation.
So they're in Creek Nation. I should have noticed Haggerty, duh.
No.
Okay, right. That would have gave me the tip off. He seems plagued with a couple of obstacles, proving that she is the daughter of the people on the Dawes. She was not personally enrolled on Dawes herself. She was one of their older children who was still back in Marshall, Texas. His ancestor is listed in their household on the 1880 census. However, it doesn't specify a relationship to the head of household, which is strange because that's the census that does. It's supposed to list relationship. So the parents are Solomon and Martha Haggerty, have been married since 1875. Their daughter Lizzie was born between 1871 and 73. On the 1880, Lizzie's listed as Lizzie Hawkins. I did some research and discovered that Hawkins' last name was the last name of Martha's mother, which was Lorena Hawkins, to me, this gives indication that Martha is her mother, really need help. The thing is, you need the connective tissue records in order to establish this. You need something on paper that says that those are her parents, and you can't really go an alternate route. It's got to be direct. And you can't say, oh, but this is her sister and we can prove it through the sister. No, you have to prove it through your direct lineal ancestor. So my thought is you need to find out if there's any death records for this individual. Did they live long enough to get a death certificate? Did they live long enough for Social Security, where you can get the Social Security application and it clearly lists the names of the parents? You might have to do that in order for you to get the stuff you need. Angela, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, the one thing that has me a little bit concerned is finding this family in 1880 and 1870. And I'm hoping that you have this family living in Indian Territory, because if they're in Marshall, Texas, they're living in the United States. And so, and this is something to be careful with. And Nika, I know you know this as well, and so does Gail, I'm sure. Sometimes you may be dealing with a name that's kind of a common name, and your folks always lived in Texas and never lived in the territory. That might be a coincidence of common names, and it might not necessarily be the name of somebody who's in the Creek Nation, or in any of the five tribes, because generally a person has to have been able to prove that they were continually in the territory. So that certainly is a concern that I would have about that, to make sure
Right.
that it's not just a coincidence of names of someone living in Texas who never lived in Oklahoma or never lived in the territory. So it's something that would be worth researching. And again, as Nika said, it's got to be lineal descent. You can't go, well, it's my auntie. Well, your auntie is a sibling of one of your parents. So it should be able to go as direct line, lineal descent for sure.
Yeah, I'll also add too, I've noticed, especially with some of the relations I have from a genetic standpoint, that they do end up going to East Texas. But
Yeah,
when you get to those records on 1880, it's going to say the people were born in the Cherokee Nation. Like
there
it's
you
gonna
go.
say that. It's not gonna say Texas. So the challenge again is with having her parents be the people enrolled on Dawes, and then she's not in the household with them. Um, Ideally, you would want them to be in the household. But the thing is, you can't, like, it's strange. Like, you can't necessarily use Dawes to validate a claim for citizenship. Like, you can use Dawes for like the card and the number issue, but you can't go into the packet and bring that out, and that's considered a certified record, which is a little bit strange, right? Because that's the test by which citizenship is granted, but you can't use that as a source.
I know it's crazy.
It's a
It
little
is. Yeah.
weird. It's weird.
Any other questions or concerns that we should be addressing here? Oh, I
Let's
see.
see. Lots of thank yous. This was informative. Thank you. Stay safe, everyone. We will. Thank you for
I
your
have
participation.
one.
Okay.
How can someone tell if they're looking at the right answer, especially when the names or spellings vary?
Okay. One of the golden rules, spelling doesn't count. Okay. Again, how do you pronounce the name Reed? Reed. How do you pronounce the name that's spelled Reid? Reed. Were your ancestors, especially if you're looking, let's say in 1880, were they literate? Were they talking to just a census taker, writing down those names, and the family may spell it Reid today, but the census taker heard Reed and wrote Reed. And in many cases, especially families that had been at one time enslaved, they didn't say, "Oh, spell that Reed. You spelled it wrong." They had no influence on the way a name was written until what, 1980 and 1990, when we started self-writing. You had no choice in what was written down because the enumerator did the writing, not the family members. So, but pay attention to those given names. Did all the siblings seem to correspond to what is already known from one census year to another? Just like I gave the example of Harriet and Violet, and then a cousin mentions Elijah because that was a totally different surname. Oh, I went back and there was Elijah. I never heard of Elijah. My mother never knew Elijah, but Elijah was the child of Amanda's second husband. We didn't even know she had a second husband, but these things happened. So for sure, you do want to be able to follow again a direct line, not through the auntie or through the cousin. And a lot of times people will say, and I'm sure you've heard this, Nika, well, I'm trying to enroll, but my cousin has all the information and he or she won't share it. Well, you can go research it too. It's all in the public domain. Go get it. And furthermore, you and your cousin don't have the same exact genealogy because you have a different mother and different father. That's why you're cousins and not siblings. Go and get the information. It can be found for sure.
Right. Okay. So back to the Creek folks that were brought up before with roll numbers. He mentions that they moved to Oklahoma. That's right. Like I'm sitting here like, how are they enrolling? Because the whole point of Dawes is, especially for freedmen, is to validate that people returned back to their nations within the parameters established by the treaties of 1866. So when you say someone moved back to Oklahoma, like that's telling us that they left the nation and came back. But still, regardless of if they moved back, you still gonna have to prove Lizzie. They ain't gonna just take her just because you said. And you can't. I've even had people say, "I'm calling the Secretary of the Interior." I'm like, you can call Deb Haaland all you want to. She ain't gonna reverse no decision on no
She's
dog
not there
dog.
anymore. Don't forget who's in the White House.
Lord, I forgot. She ain't
She's
there no
out of a
more.
job. So whoever
Right,
the secretary is, and they
right.
definitely are not going to take not going to take
No,
it to
they're
any
not
degree
taking
of
any
seriousness. Yeah.
calls.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another one. I think this is several questions. Did the Creek Indians play a large role in building Black Wall Street in Oklahoma?
Oklahoma is interesting. It became a state in 1907. People started coming into the territory prior to the 1900s. In fact, prior to 1900, we were referring to those state folks as intruders. There's even an intruder census. People from all over the place, and Tulsa as well. You'll find people from Kansas. In fact, you had an auditor in Kansas, Edwin McCabe, who was putting ads in Black newspapers throughout the South. Come to Oklahoma, fertile land, and it's going to be a great place for colored folks. So you have a lot of people who were definitely coming in from Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and so on. But you do have people who are already there. Now, is most of Tulsa Creek Nation? No, about half of Tulsa's Creek, but there's a street. I can't remember what street it is, Memorial. I can't remember what street it is. The other half of Tulsa's Cherokee Nation as well. So understand there were a lot of people who were definitely descendants of Creeks, but keep in mind, by statehood, and in those early years of statehood, which would have been also included 1921, the year of the massacre, you had a lot of Creeks who were living on their land allotments, 160 acres in the Creek Nation. So there may have been one or two members of the family who migrated, but there were also people from the Cherokee Nation in Tulsa. There were also people from the Choctaw Nation who had left for whatever reason. And there were those people referred to as state Negroes who had come in from other places in the South. Definitely, you have individuals who were Creek, who were Black Creeks, who definitely were part of the community. Were they the majority of Black people? I'm not sure that that can be determined or has been determined that majority of Blacks were Creeks. I think you had a mixture in Tulsa. And what I've seen from the records that I've researched in Justice for Greenwood, I have seen individuals from multiple states who were there, individuals who owned businesses and who were there and contributing to making Greenwood what it was. Wonderful community that it was. It was definitely a very, very diverse community of Black people.
So I want to pose this question to each of you, Angela, Nika, Gail, and Ron. Have you found any interesting examples from Greenwood or Oklahoma Freeman records that show how powerful a census data can be?
Ooh.
Somebody want to answer that? I'll let either Gail or
Right. I'm like, Lord, today, how powerful census data could be. I mean, that's a loaded question. You know, Oklahoma had the most black towns in the nation. So even that initial data from like the 1910 census or the 1900 territorial census is going to tell you something. Hey, Paisley Ty. Um, so I mean,
there's Sean.
I would also add, I think too, especially when you're talking Indian territory, the power of the US Census in the territorial area is the fact that you have people documented in the townships and ranges where they were living, which is the legal land descriptions. So sometimes that can help you orient a little bit, especially for land allotments that people might have gotten. Like I like that in the Cherokee Nation where it says township so and so and in the Cherokee Nation. I don't know what else you would add. I mean, census impact, that's a very broad question depending on the
Yeah,
nation.
census is sometimes described as the engine that propels genealogy. I mean, we mention it all the time, start with 1950 and work back, because that's the one document that's going to be consistent across all the generations. You just have to look for this name and find them 10 years earlier, if they actually age 10 years between census years. But that is the main engine. And then, of course, it shoots off in other directions, vital records, marriage records, and so on, military records, whatever else may be out there that's unique to that particular state. Because in some cases, some states had a state census. Alabama had a state census in 1865. I believe Kansas had a state census also after the Civil War. Every state didn't have one, though. So, but yeah, the census, that's the engine that propels genealogy research. So, yeah, power is the word to use. So, for sure, for sure.
Okay, Ron?
Yes, I totally agree with that. I'm working with one family right now that they are found on the 1920 census. And it even shows on this document where he was killed in the Tulsa race. They called it race massacre, race riot at that time. So it's been very helpful like that way. So I would encourage everybody to go by the census to see where you're at and see what did they go to, what did they move to, what did they do, how were they involved in things. So it's very, very useful. Very useful. Thank you.
Gail, do you have anything?
Is she there? Is she unmuted? She may have stepped away for a second or so. But by all means, I guess the census is loaded. That's all I can say. And
I had a question. I just had a question about the Nika Smith. I think that just came in. Was she looking for Hawkins as a Creek citizen?
Oh, you're talking about one of the people that answered the
oh, she
question.
was addressing a question. Yeah.
Yeah, let me go back.
No, you didn't answer. Was that a yes or no? Was it a Hawkins? Was the Hawkins the person, the name, the family name they were looking for?
Haggerty, I think.
I think it's Haggerty.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Oh, wait, but it was Haggerty, but the person ended up going in. He says that she was in Hawkins on the 1880 census, but her parents are supposed to be Haggerty's. And the maternal grandmother of the individual in question was supposed to be a Hawkins.
Oh, gotcha. Any other questions from either the classroom, the live room, or from the
Hold on,
stream?
Angela.
Yeah, there's
Go ahead,
there's
ma'am.
more in the chat.
Ma'am, did you want to finish your question?
Who's asking that question?
Yeah, she can't hear you unless she uses this.
1 second, she's.
Okay, I'm sorry. My question was whether or not she has been to the tribal headquarters and checked such documents in the library, like the Creek Nation Library, like proof of heirship. That can provide a lot of information, as can some of the property records, and as well as some of the cemeteries. Because we have a family cemetery, and there are a lot of Hawkins, Corbrays, Middlebrooks, and other folks. from the 1800s.
I would also suggest too, especially if he knows that the people who got the Dawes number are his ancestors, that land had to be passed down through generations if it was not lost by the initial one. So to sort of combine the answer that we just got, look to see if they have a will or a probate that you can get an official copy of that lists out the names of their grown children that the land would pass to. That would be another way that you could potentially validate relationships. But I don't know if they, again, they're weird about what they accept and what they don't. And generally, they only want things like birth and death certificates.
We have another question up here.
So through my research, can you hear me?
Talk.
You hear me?
Yes, I was just curious who's talking. I don't know whose voice that is. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great. Through my research, I've learned on Ancestry that my great grandfather applied for Cherokee Nation or a tribal roll number and actually found documentation that he was actually denied. Do you have any idea why this would happen? He was born here in 1865.
Where you said here? Where is here?
Here in Oklahoma. So
Oh, you're in Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, Wagner County.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay.
So I'll let Nika take that. She's a Cherokee citizen.
So generally speaking, people were rejected for a number of reasons. Usually it's that they couldn't prove that they had come back to the nation by the terms of the treaty. You had to come back within 6 months. And if you could not state emphatically that you were back, one of the ways that you could bring witnesses that will corroborate your story, but then the opposite side would bring in people to potentially discredit you and say, no, they weren't back by that time. Also, you may have, they would use records like the 1880 Cherokee Census to validate whether or not somebody was back. And if they couldn't find you or a parent on that, they would reject you. So for instance, even though both of my great grandparents were Cherokee freedmen, I only get my citizenship from my great grandfather because everyone else on my great grandmother's side was rejected. Even when I often talk about, I have a well-known ancestor in the Cherokee Nation. Had he not been killed, he would have got rejected by Dawes because on 1870, he is clearly in Kansas, right?
Yeah.
His sister, everybody, their whole family is still in Kansas because a lot of our folks went up into Kansas during the war and some of them stayed and they ended up coming back later. That's my theory as to why most of the Cherokee freedmen are from the extreme north portion of the Cherokee Nation is because it was like they heard the treaty, they said come back, and then folks said, okay, we just gonna put a pinky toe back into Oklahoma. So the way that you find out why the rejection took place is to move beyond the card. It's not just the card. It's a 3-step process. It's the card, then the card leads to an application packet. If you get rejected, you do not get a land allotment and you don't have a land allotment jacket. You just stay at the application packet stage. There's also the thing where people would come in and they would mark them doubtful and then they would move them to a rejected card. So you might have you might actually have 2 application packets in 2 different numbers. Most of my ancestors that were rejected have 2. They start off at a doubtful and then they roll to a rejected. So you want to look at that number at the top right-hand corner of the Dawes card. That will tell you the application, the number for the application, and it correlates with the packet. And the packet for rejections, my God, I don't think I've seen a rejection packet that's shorter than 50 pages. I don't think I ever have.
They are fantastic. Yes.
Yeah.
Have you read, I'll ask the person who asked that question, have you read the packets? Have you read the interviews? Because you'll sometimes find the answer when you read that packet. If you have not, definitely Ancestry just has a link, enrollment applications. Click on that and read that file. And it'll tell you, when did you get back? Or they may ask another question. Oh, well, you lived in Texas. Oh, you've been there for the last 15 years and you just came back 2 years ago. Again, that person did not come in, 6 months after the treaty was signed. 6 months? 6 weeks, 6 months, I believe it is. Yeah. And so, read the packets though. They're so revealing. And sometimes they're far more interesting to read, those rejected packets, by all means. So any other questions? How are we doing with time? Are we okay?
I have another one.
Okay.
What kind of clues in census records might help confirm connections to survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre?
Ooh.
Well, I'd only say the 1920 census is the proof because they were there at least a year before, and
Right.
assuming they didn't move. Beyond that, 1930, 1940, that's not necessarily a clue about what happened in 1921. That's 9 years before the 1930 census. But I would probably urge you to look maybe at the city directories. Were they there? Because there is a city directory of Tulsa for 1921. Because I think that the city directory people collected their info before the massacre. So that would be my suggestion. But from the later census years, nothing's jumping off in my mind because, again, something that happened in an off census year, especially. It's not, remember the census is federal record. It's not just a city. It's not a city record. It's a federal document. So nothing's occurring to me to answer that in I guess connection to the census, those other census years. Maybe something you can think of, Nika. I mean, nothing's popping up in my
City
mind.
directories, we often use those. So there is one from 1920, one's from 1922, 23. We also may look at like World War I draft cards, because at least for the men that registered, they're there by 1918, 1917. So that's putting
Yeah.
you close. Also, we love Oklahoma research, and one of the reasons why we do is because of the newspaper coverage there. You may actually find family members mentioned in the newspaper. One of my favorite finds recently, I was sharing this with Angela and Jasmine, was the man that divorced his wife because she wouldn't cook, and that was in the newspaper, telling
There you go.
all the business. I was like, Lord, okay, but it proved that they were in Tulsa County when I needed them to be there. So you've got that, and then like I would say, utilize. I actually put this in the Q&A here because people were asking about how to order birth and death certificates. We are lucky that we have the Oklahoma State Vital Records Index online. The URL is OK2 explore.health.ok.gov. That's the website where you can order birth certificates and death certificates for the state. And even if you don't have a year, you can search by name and search by location or search by county. That's another record that you could use. Also, again, we blessed. This is the most documented group of Black people, Oklahomans are. Marriage licenses. Those are available on Ancestry and on Family Search. That will help you pinpoint where someone is because the marriage license will say Angela Walton Raji of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Nika Smith of Los Angeles, California get married in Muskogee County on October 23rd, 2025. It'll tell you where the person is. So that's
Yeah,
another thing you can do. Right. I'm trying to think. Those are most of the things that we generally look at in order to plot
all the time.
someone there
Yeah.
off the top of our head. Yeah, those are like our go-to
Yeah,
ones.
for sure. One thing about Oklahoma, I'd also just throw in that's useful are the school records. However, there's the one caveat, I guess. All of the counties are the school records, school census records are available, except Tulsa County. Go figure. They have never been microfilmed or digitized. I can find records from even Oklahoma Territory, way out, Altus, Lawton, Western Oklahoma, nothing on Tulsa County. So anyone have any connections with the school board in Tulsa, please ask them to get their records digitized from those Oklahoma school census records. So, but they're very useful in terms of the family history data.
I have one final question for you all. How do you see this kind of community work, this genealogy work, like what we're doing for Justice for Greenwood impacting the next generation?
Boy.
That's I mean, it's a good question. But I guess because I'll just say genealogy in general impacts the future generation. You're opening doors to the past for generations yet to even be born. And when questions are asked, what we do today is going to answer questions for people we will never meet, who are going to be born 100 years from now, who are going to be curious. So there will be people 100 years from now who've heard of Tulsa, who have roots in Tulsa, who want to know about Tulsa, or who want to know just in general about their family history. We're paying it forward by what we're doing. As we're opening the doors to the past, we're researching, we're proving lineal descent of many, many families already, connecting them from wherever they may be living, from Alaska to Panama Canal. We're opening the doors to confirming something they may have heard in family history. Yeah, there was that riot back in the 1900s in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Some may say, where's Oklahoma? What is that? Well, that's where our family was, and they were part of a terrible massacre that occurred. And I think this Anderson family, I think somebody's documented them. And yeah, my grandfather was verified by something called Justice for Greenwood. And hopefully what we're doing is opening the door to the past for generations yet to come. And I'll leave it at that.
I think that was a great answer. And I would also add, we have so many of us who are displaced. You think about that in the context of this year with Hurricane Katrina, right? And the fact that the scores of folks that were, survived the storm or left before it hit are all over the United States, and bringing that culture to different spots and have never returned in the 20 years. They're still living displaced. With us, our migration and our displacement started earlier. For me, I'm a Californian all day long, but I also drive on a highway that my people walked all the way to the Indian Territory, literally drive on it every day. Or I pass by, the land that my home sits on is Chickasaw. You see what I'm saying? But if I didn't have the context for who my family was and who my grandmother was, I would be entirely detached from it and not thinking I had any connection to it. So I think the promise of what we do with this for future generations is the passing down of information. And it's the things like when my son goes into a museum and he's there with his Cub Scout troop and they're reading about the Cherokee, and my son goes, "Those are my people." He's able to identify that and to say that clearly and to stand on business. And if somebody comes to ask him, he can say, "I got a blue card." That's what
I can prove it.
And I can prove it. And that's what he did. His little 10-year-old self last week. I was shocked. But
really?
Yeah, because I'm constantly talking to him about it. But you know what I mean? Sometimes you don't know what downloads to kids. So he would know, he stood on business in that museum, and I was so proud of him. So that's why this is important. I grew up in ignorance, the way that the old folks used to say. I grew up in ignorance. I knew my grandmother was from Oklahoma, but I didn't know where. I didn't know half the stuff that I knew until I started doing research. And the benefit of me doing the research is that my son can walk proudly in who he is. So, and say definitively who he is. So, yep.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening for the stories of us breaking down the census record. On behalf of Justice for Greenwood, I want to thank the incredible genealogists, Angela, Gail, Ron, and Nika, for sharing their time, knowledge, and passion with us tonight. We hope this workshop gave you new tools, inspiration to continue uncovering your family stories. Remember, genealogy isn't just about names and dates, it's about reclaiming histories that connect us all. A follow-up email will be sent to all of you with the recording link, a short survey, and some helpful genealogy resources mentioned tonight. And don't forget, our next workshop in the series is Vital Records, and it'll take place Thursday, November 20th. We'd like to see you here in person or on Zoom. Thank you again for spending your evening with us and for being a part of this ongoing journey to preserve and honor our history. Have a wonderful evening.
Good night, everybody.